I get dry mouth when I talk. When I agreed to do this, I was talking to Michael Snar, and I said, well, I was planning on using some reruns, sermons I've done at other churches, but I said, there were a couple that I've done here already. And what I can only think was an attempt to be encouraging, he said, Lee, I guarantee you no one will remember what you said. So who does a sermon on a genealogy of Jesus? Back in 1985, I was fresh out of seminary. I was attending the church that I grew up going to, and a friend of mine from seminary was our pastor. He and his wife needed to be gone the first Sunday of Advent, and he had already planned out this series of sermons. The main title was The Coming Kingdom, and the first one was Unfolding. And so he asked me if I would be willing to fill the pulpit, and I said, sure. And he said, before you answer too quickly, let me tell you that this is the lectionary reading is the genealogy of Jesus, and you can say no if you'd like. And I thought about it for, I don't know, minutes or days, and I told him I would do it because I think that you can find something of worth in all of Scripture. So, let's see what we can learn. In the 1970s, there came to the world a new genre in television called the miniseries. We're well used to that by now, but then it was new. The first of its kind was the story of a black man who traced his family back to a tribe in Africa. The story followed Kunta Kinte to colonial America and told the story of his descendants and their suffering through the trials of slavery and newly acquired freedom. Finally, coming to the present 1970s descendant, Alex Haley, who wrote Roots and inspired many people to look again or for the first time at their ancestry, their lineage, the roots to their own family tree. Mr. Haley's search took him many and varied places in search of the truth about who he really was and where he really came from. Now, we can all say or admit to a certain extent that a part of our identity is contained in those who have gone before us and given us our names and our values. For myself, I can almost recite the questions that are asked after I say my name, especially in Southern Ohio Brethren circles. I'm Lee Bowman from Vandalia, Ohio. Who's your father? Are you related to Ken, Carl, or Walt? Are you Ohio Brethren, or Ohio Bowman, or Virginia Bowman? All of those are questions about my identity through asking about my family. Now, I'm sure that Mr. Haley learned some very unpleasant and painful things about the experiences of his ancestors, but knowing them at all must have brought him to a better understanding of his family and made him feel closer to them. What can happen when we begin digging up the roots to our family tree was humorously illustrated in the situation comedy Newhart. It seems that the ancestors of the members of an historical society once lived at the Stratford Inn, now owned by Newhart, of course. Since he was both the current owner and an historian, these ladies asked him to research their ancestresses and deliver a speech to the group at their next meeting. Imagine the ensuing comedy when Newhart discovered that the Stratford Inn, at the time in question, had been a brothel, and these ladies' ancestresses had been employed there. Needless to say, it came as a shock, but they were able to accept it and grow from the experience and newly acquired knowledge nonetheless. From the scripture text read today, we can see that neither we nor Alex Haley nor even the Quakers at large were the first to consider our roots or genealogy important. Many times throughout the Old Testament, lists of names are found. These are affectionately called the begats and are looked upon with dread and disdain by readers. In fact, this week someone asked me what my text would be, and I said Matthew 1, 1 through 17, and she said, oh no. Begats. Many of you might get an impression of who that might have been. Many of us in our Bible study just glance over them and look for where the story picks up again. In college, when we came upon these genealogies in our studies, we would groan and sigh. Why did they write these things? What could possibly have been the reasoning behind it, and what message could they possibly hold for us? Fortunately, we had patient professors who would point out the answers to our often asked questions. Why did the Hebrew people give so much energy to compiling these lists of names? As I was saying earlier, to a certain extent, our own identity is entwined with that of our forebears. If this is true for us, it was much more true for the Hebrews. Their life as a nation stemmed from the life of three patriarchs in their faith and in their God, who was a different God than any worshipped anywhere around them. There's a creedal recital that was an important part of the Hebrew faith, which began, "A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous." It goes on to tell all the great happenings in the nation's history. And in a sense, this creedal recital is a genealogy of the nation. It was important to the Hebrews to remember the people and events which made their nation and faith what it was. By and large, a genealogy was intended to do one or more of five things. Provide an individual with identification for legal purposes, such as inheritance. Establish rights to social positions, for example, nobility or the priesthood. Prove racial purity. Demonstrate relationship to an eminent worthy of the past. Or strengthen position or authority by tracing back to an important ancestral appointment. All in all, it was a way of helping people remember who they were. In a December 1980s issue of Messenger, the Church of the Brethren monthly publication, Warren Groff, who was president of Bethany Theological Seminary when I attended, had an article in which he tells the story of a young Pennsylvania boy named Warren Groff, who at different times in his life received the admonition from his parents, "Remember who you are." Behind those four words was the deeper, extended reminder to remember who his family was, his parents, his neighborhood, his church. Remember who you are, who has gone before you, what they stood for, what they've handed down to you. This is why the Hebrews put so much into remembering these lists of names of ancestors. Each name represented a life lived, a person who contributed to the entire line and the entire story. Each name was an end to the line up to that point, a midpoint to the line as a whole, a beginning to the line from that point on. Each name represents one or more small stories in the larger story of the family. Or in the case of the Hebrews, of the faith and of the nation as well. So let's take a few moments to consider several of the names, not all, mentioned in Jesus' genealogy that I read earlier. It begins like this: the book of the genealogy of Jesus, the anointed one, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the shortened version. It's like the Cliff's Notes or Master Plots or Reader's Digest condensed version of a book. Those marvelous tools that help you study for tests and write papers when you hadn't read the book that you were supposed to in the first place. I can't be the only one. It hits the high points, but it isn't much for details. This little summary connects Jesus to David, Israel's greatest king, and Abraham, the patriarch, the one to whom Yahweh made the first promise of the land, and with whom Yahweh, the God of Israel, first covenanted himself. Right away, when you read the summary, you think, hey, this Jesus has credentials. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. The list of the patriarchs, the big three to whom all Israel traced their lineage. This was a nationalistic and a patriotic statement. It says, I am a Hebrew, descended from Abraham, to whom God made the first promise of the land, and with whom God entered into a binding and reciprocal covenant. From Isaac, the child of Abraham and Sarah's old age, and from Jacob, Israel himself, progenitor of the 12 brothers, who were progenitors of the 12 tribes. It's also a faith statement. Throughout the Bible, we find phrases like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the three who had the personal relationship with God. These three received the promise of the land and the promise that their descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky. These were the giants of the faith, and we can kind of imagine what a person would be thinking while reciting this line. All the stories they had heard while growing up, these lives being raised as examples. Moving on down the line. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the fourth son of Jacob by Leah. And the tribal name which was given to the southern portion of the kingdom when it was split by civil war. And Judah, the father of Perez by Tamar. Here the genealogy takes a turn away from the traditional genealogy. Israel was a patristic culture, a male-centered and male-dominated society. All emphasis was placed on the man, the husband, the son, the father. What we have here is a woman listed in a genealogy. It's almost an aside, just a mere mention. But, as I said before, each name represents a life lived and one or more small stories in the larger familial story. Of course, the story of Judah and Tamar would be recalled, especially when mentioned in this genealogical context, and especially in Jesus' genealogy. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah, and she seduced him. Not a pleasant thing to have surface in one's genealogy, but let's look at the situation a little more closely. Tamar's husband had died, and Judah had not followed through with his promise to give Tamar another of his sons. So she tricked him into fathering her children. When Judah tried to have her burned for being a prostitute, she told him the truth, and he said, she is more righteous than I, because I didn't fulfill my part of the bargain. So the woman mentioned, and of whom scandalous behavior was suspected, was found to be more righteous than the father of the tribe, Judah himself. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Here's another of the women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy, and another interesting situation. Whereas Tamar was accused of being a harlot, Rahab actually was a harlot, a professional. How can this be? What is her name doing in this list of all lists? Well, you see, even though Rahab is remembered as a harlot, she is remembered more for being a believer in the God of Israel, Yahweh, when no one else around her was. And the promise made to Israel so that she aided the two spies who had been sent to Jericho and helped them escape, and thus played an important part in the conquering of Jericho and the beginning of the acquisition of the land. Again, a woman whose character was questionable acted in a way revealing her to be a woman of great faith. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. I wrote my master's thesis on Ruth. I could bore you to tears talking about Ruth, and maybe I will in this meeting. But right now, we'll just settle for a short aside. Ruth was a Moabitess by birth, not an Israelite. Yet she, like the other two women mentioned so far in the genealogy, is found to be among the most righteous of Old Testament characters. Ruth, like Tamar, is a widow. As such, she is entitled to the institution of levirate marriage, whereby the dead husband's closest relative would take the widow and father children with her for the dead man, so that his name would live on. As in the story of Tamar, the nearest kinsman does not act on his obligation. So Ruth, like Tamar, sets the wheels in motion, though her method is a little different than Tamar's. Ruth is a foreigner, but she knows Jewish culture and customs seemingly better than the Hebrews. Not only that, but like Rahab, Ruth has not been a believer in Israel's God, and now proclaims faith in the God of Israel through her deeds as much as, if not more than, just her words, just like Tamar and Rahab. All the while surrounded by people who proclaim faith in God, but have a little more trouble acting out that faith, just as in the stories of Tamar and Rahab. And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, the king. Ah, David. What don't we know about David? David was the faithful shepherd, the psalmist, the brave arms bearer who stood up against the giant Goliath and beat him with an ancient version of the slingshot. David the king. David was the paradigm king, the king whose reputation every other king had to try to live up to. Under David, Israel reached its zenith in power. Israel was mighty. Israel was faithful. Israel was being ruled by the one God had chosen, David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. David and the wife of Uriah. Bathsheba is the woman who's being referred to here. Now, Solomon is the son born to David and Bathsheba after their marriage. But the designation of Bathsheba as the wife of Uriah brings to mind another story, one of a mighty king and an obedient subject, of a guilty king trying to cover up his folly through deceit and finally murder, but who can't hide his wrongdoings and justly, if unknowingly, denounces himself. So we've discussed several of the names found in the genealogy of Jesus. 4 of them women. They aren't usually found in genealogies. Each of them found to be the picture of righteousness despite questionable circumstances, or found to shed light on the unrighteous behavior of one of the characters with whom they are connected. If our identity is partially made up of that of our ancestors and ancestresses, as I said earlier, what does this genealogy say of Jesus? First of all, it shows us that Jesus has the pedigree, the credentials. In this genealogy are found the names of the patriarchs and many kings. Jesus has every right to position, authority, nobility, inheritance, even messiahship, because it was a common belief that the Messiah would descend from David. Yes, sir, Jesus' genealogy has the names of all the muckety-mucks of the Jewish faith. But there's something more important to learn. Jesus' real identity during his ministry wasn't one of pedigree and position. Jesus' identity was wrapped up in the people he ministered to, and that is symbolized in the other names we find in his genealogy. Where Jesus is concerned, ancestrally and ministerially, there is no racial exclusiveness. Ruth was a Moabitess, the woman at the well, a Samaritan. There is no patriarchal bent. Women play a prominent part in the genealogy and in Jesus' life and ministry. And there is no favoritism of the pious. The big names in the genealogy are a little tarnished. And in Jesus' life, he didn't run with the church crowd, but with tax collectors, prostitutes, adulterers, political activists, and the like. William Barclay says it very well. Here at the very beginning of the gospel, we are given a hint of the all-embracing width of the love of God. God can find his servants amongst those from whom the respectable Orthodox would shudder away in horror. If Matthew had ransacked the pages of the Old Testament for improbable candidates, what message does this genealogy hold for us today? First, it's a message of hope. We needn't be perfect to be included in the unfolding of God's kingdom. We need only be willing to do God's bidding when the time comes. The genealogy also serves to challenge us. Think for a moment about those from whom we shudder away in horror. Who can you think of who is like Tamar, the righteous seductress, Rahab, the faithful prostitute, Ruth, the godly foreigner, or Bathsheba, the obedient adulteress? Might they be playing an important part in the unfolding of God's kingdom? And what of us good church people? Are we like Judah, who knowingly does not uphold his promise until we must at last say, alas, I'm not so righteous after all? Or like the near kinsman who shirks his responsibility of taking care of a marginal member of society, finally pushing it off on someone else? Or are we like David, the great and faithful king, with double standards? Let us remember who we are. We are part of God's unfolding kingdom. Each one of us, no matter what our past or present circumstances. Let us consider the part we play in that unfolding.